Welcome. Today we're diving into a very common topic here on the Nonprofits, Christian hypocrisy. Specifically today we're going to talk about the fall of Jerry Falwell Jr., followed by his triumphant return to Liberty University on homecoming week. It's one of those stories that make you question the institutions that enforce extreme moral codes, which often they fail to follow themselves. Falwell's scandal isn't just about one man, it's about the hypocrisy that festers in places like Liberty University, where secrecy, repression, and power collide. We'll also look at how financial interests, influenced by the university's response as they tried to preserve their reputation and avoid alienating Falwell's loyal following, while they tried to grapple with the fabricated moral crisis that really is brought on by them setting absurd expectations. This story is from Religious News by Karen Swallow Pryor on October 4th, 2024. Now, Kara, I was going to go to you first, and I was wondering, what do you think that this says about the standards at places like Liberty University?
Well, that's a really interesting question, given that in this article, it's noted that Falwell Jr. Had mentioned that he didn't think he should be held to a higher standard than many of the other individuals in leadership who had been caught being involved in some sort of sex scandal or other misconduct and had then been, quote unquote, forgiven or allowed back in. And I find that to be particularly interesting given the strict moral code of conduct that Liberty University has for its students, which includes prohibitions, very strict prohibitions against seemingly innocuous things that are regarded as sexual misconduct, including hand-holding, being gay, using pronouns that aren't consistent with the sex assigned at birth. These are strictly prohibited activities for students at this university that Falwell himself presided over and presumably enforced, and yet he doesn't want to be held to a higher standard, by which he means not being held accountable for actual sexual misconduct involving abuse of his power and that of his and his wife's position at the university. So what I'm really hearing is that it's not that he was being held to a higher standard, it's that he was being held to no standard at all, apparently.
I think that we find that far too often in organizations like this, that they create first, as you mentioned, an unrealistic expectation they set for everyone involved and act surprised when people don't live up to it. But in cases like this, oftentimes we see that the people who are supposedly upholding this standard to others and enforcing it with punitive damages to other people don't live up to them themselves. So I don't think that that's something out of the ordinary. And unfortunately, seems to be something that seems to be quite common. So AJ, I was wondering about you. We see this restoration of powerful abusers. Why do you think congregations are more inclined to identify with the abuser rather than the victim? What cultural or theological factors do you think go into this?
I think in this case, it has a lot to do with the doctrines that are taught in church. You know, it's all about Jesus forgiving you, and so you are meant to forgive everybody, just like because Jesus says to forgive everyone, and that is exactly what has seemed to be happening in situations like with Falwell. They put aside the victims and they put them as not even the victims themselves. Like they turn into the perpetrators, and the victims are harassed, and then the entire institutions expect the abusers to be forgiven.
I agree. I think that far too often what we see is that we see this prodigal son comes back into the fold. Let's congratulate and welcome him back, and let's pretend that whatever the ramifications, those don't go away. Just because you have the person come back, it doesn't fix the problem they created. And really, in a situation like this, it seems like that these two people were just by their own admission, it seemed like more of an act. Did you get that kind of feel, Kara, that this was just an act on their part?
Oh, absolutely. And this, of course, all came about, this reinstatement, after the settling of their lawsuit, which had to do with the university's ability to use the Falwell name, that of Falwell Sr. I don't think they were trying to use Jr.'s name and likeness quite as much, but these legal consequences followed. As soon as those were handled and taken care of, all of a sudden everything was fine. And now he's brought back. And it wasn't really that we're worried about his sexual misconduct or his abuse of his power. And, that admission on his part, basically, that it was too much to expect, that he should, not behave in inappropriate ways sexually with students and others at the university is almost the same thing as admitting that this student honor code and all of these rules are impossibly strict. And there are prohibitions against, almost any kind of sexual conduct, even against consenting adults or even with consenting adults. And that's an unrealistic standard. The one that they're enforcing against the students is an unrealistic standard. And yet the leadership of the university is allowed to go around and engage in any kind of behavior, apparently. And then as soon as all of the financial and legal issues in the background are buttoned up, all of a sudden, well, we don't mind. We have to forgive him. We couldn't possibly expect someone to abide by any of our rules, apparently.
Yeah, and apparently it wasn't just for Falwell himself. It seemed like some of the documents that the lawsuit showed that one of the arguments that they used in the defense for him to come back was that the fact that other high-ranking university officials, including a former president and a former dean, had been welcomed back on campus after they had some type of, misconduct, like having an affair or other sexual scandals. And they argued that Falwell should not be held, as you said, to a higher moral standard than everybody else. So it was like, well, they did it, so it's fine, right? Like, I should be able to come back too. And, that's what happened. The lawsuits were dropped and then they settled. Then he not only returned to the campus, but he did it during the homecoming week, which was gave him a hero's welcome back and full of praise. And, it's just, it came down to forgiveness and celebration for the abusers and then hush money for the victims. So they will just sit down and shut up.
Exactly. Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
The victims are just an inconvenience to the story that they're trying to present. Because look, as you mentioned, AJ, coming back on homecoming, this isn't by accident. They're laying out a redemption story, and we're all forgiven and everything's good. And of course, it could have nothing to do with the fact that the university was doing very poorly before Falwell was involved, and then all of a sudden he made it a very profitable institution. I'm sure it had absolutely nothing about that and all about the forgiveness of our near and dear Lord Jesus. Okay, maybe I don't think any of that. But Kara, did you have something to say? You were talking before I interrupted.
Oh, yeah. No, I mean, I think I interrupted you, but, I don't want to be held to a higher standard or anything on the interrupting and the conversation turn taking. But no, I do think exactly as both of you have pointed out, this is just, again, another example where we're celebrating the abuser and the powerful leader who has engaged in misconduct while essentially punishing or hushing up anyone who had the temerity to point it out. And it's always the other people involved in these things that are then the victims that are blamed or accused of instigating the wrongdoing. And, we never hear from them again or about them being reinstated or having any sort of restitution. But here we are celebrating the homecoming of Mr. Falwell returning again to be reinstated in a position to engage in this same behavior again, with him having essentially admitted that he thinks the standard of conduct that they were holding him to was impossible. So what does that tell you about his future behavior?
One thing I did find interesting is that both he and his wife essentially came out with, it was all an act. He said, now I had the last name, but people expect me to be religious, but I'm really not that kind of guy. And that's fine. He'd probably have a happier and healthier life if he didn't live under an unrealistic expectation like that. But I think that that's something that religion tends to do, not just to its leadership, but even worse, because they get the buy and get the pass if they do something wrong. But it's all the other people that go and live into Liberty University and spend their lives thinking this is what I have to be, and then go out and leave the university trying to be that person and really setting themselves up for failure. Now, one thing I did notice noticed is I did read where one of the people stated it cost Rachel Hollander said it costs you something to side with the vulnerable. Why is it that siding with the victims of abuse in religious communities often comes at such a high social or personal cost? And how can we encourage more people to take that stand? AJ, I wanted to throw that question to you. What do you think?
I truly don't understand this, because you can see the harm that is being done to another human being, and you will think that naturally you want to protect that person that is being victimized, right? But it seems that in all of these religious settings, it's the complete opposite. Like we said earlier, they're just victimizing the abusers. And so I think that making sure that we speak up and that we let these people's voice what's happened to them, advocating, bringing awareness, will probably and hopefully remove the stigma around the victims of abuse, and bringing the abusers to light without making them the victim is the most important step. I don't really know exactly what we could do to make that happen, but I know that is definitely the key point, because when victims can see that they're not being vilified or humiliated, then they'll feel more comfortable sharing their stories, knowing that they will get justice and not just be put aside and paid to shut up.
Yes, I think that is one very important thing is actually allowing people, making people realize that it's a safe environment for them to do that. I think one of the problems, though, is that institutionally, when you come to issues like churches and things like this, I think there's a vested interest in churches and church-related organizations oftentimes to do quite the opposite, and not even necessarily so they can be an overt predator like these two people have been, but to be just predatory in nature towards taking advantage of other people in times of need, in situations like that. It's almost like it's part of the program for these people to be in positions of authority, and almost by definition, it means that people are going to take advantage of that authority. What was your take, Kara?
Yes, I agree with that. It's really tough to say what could be done to encourage more people to side with the victims in this, because as you both pointed out, the social costs are so high, because the system almost has that built into it, because as soon as you start siding with the victims and saying like, oh, here we see this person has been harassed or coerced or taken advantage of, we're now suggesting, and I don't mean to paint with too broad a brush here, but it's often young women and girls that are victims in these instances, or children. We're now taking away this excuse that's so often used to vilify the victims, which is that they somehow encouraged this, or they invited this through their own sin or misconduct or lasciviousness or whatever the case may be. And as soon as we start siding with them and saying, no, this person was actually victimized, they were coerced, they were intimidated, they were forced, or whatever the case may be, all of a sudden now we're placing more accountability on the people in positions of power, and nobody in a position of power wants to allow themselves to be placed at a greater risk, or apparently held to a higher standard, or any standard at all. So I think we're back to that situation again, where as long as the same people are in these positions of power, there's going to continue to be enormous pressure for everyone else in the congregation or the flock or whatever the case may be, to not side with them.
It's interesting that you mentioned that the victims are usually women and young girls, which is, I absolutely agree with that. But it seemed like the Falwells had like no limit on who they were preying on. So if you need something to be disgusted by this Halloween, let me tell you about his wife. Okay, so the story goes beyond just the pastor coming back, after committing sins, because obviously he was banned from the university because he was posting inappropriate sexually charged comments, photos, and videos of young female students, which is what you pointed out about women being the main target. But he wasn't the only one that was banned from the university. His wife, Becky, was too, because she was part of a separate sex scandal. And one of the most notable things about it was that she was having a sexual relationship with a young pool boy for several years, but this wasn't a secret to her husband. It's just like God. It seems like Falwell Jr. liked to watch, because he will, apparently the story goes that he will sit on the corner of the room and quietly watch his wife have sex with the pool boy. So I'm not one to shame people for, their sexual taste or what they do as consenting adults, because everybody deserves body autonomy, like we always talk about. But it seemed like in this case, it was just a very naive young man, and they were totally, completely predatory towards him. They lured him by promising business partnerships and real estate dealings and money. And both Falwell Jr. and his wife used their position of power and authority to abuse this young man.
Yes, I thought something you said was very important, and I completely agree. Is that, I don't care if Mrs. Falwell and the pool boy had a relationship. I don't care what Falwell Jr.'s relationship in that situation was either. It is completely not a concern to me until you start telling other people what they should do, what they can and cannot do, kicking people out of school for doing far less. When you start thinking about what they did and compare it to what they have cost people, and in the long run, they might be better off without a career that you get from Liberty University. But still, that's not my choice to make. But someone made that choice for them who wasn't me, who supposedly was their mentor and their guide, and someone who was in their leadership to make them that supposed better person that, the illusion, the facade is supposed to create. We know none of it's reality. We've talked about other people in the organization and their misdeeds, the misdeeds of the Falwells. There's misdeeds that go around for everybody. Okay, great. But once again, that goes back to, if you set an unrealistic expectation in the first place, this is what happens when you do that, when you don't talk about things and you're not open about people being, real people. And that's a whole lot of things. It's not something you could put inside of a box. And Carol, wanted to know, is there anything else that struck you about this story you wanted to discuss?
Really, I think just one of the main things that I found fascinating about this story was the way that the sort of the breadth and the range of the misconduct that took place and that was ultimately forgiven. It ranged from not only things that we would all identify as predatory or coercive or taking advantage of naive people or those who you have an undue amount of influence over, but also it included things that perhaps the folks at Liberty University regard as immoral, but secular people might not, such as the, various kinds of sexual relationships that Falwell and Becky were having, and, different kinds of proclivities and tastes. And yet that no matter what the behavior was, minor to actually predatory, I never saw any distinction really made between any of those and in any of the discussion of these incidents coming from the university. And that lack of distinction between things that are actively predatory and harming victims and abusing people versus things that someone has read the Bible and decided they have a distaste for. No distinction made whatsoever, which really to me just kind of speaks to this complete and utter lack of a sense of accountability to other human beings that's coming out of this attitude towards the behavior that's being tolerated and allowed in leadership. And I just found that rather galling.
Indeed. AJ, anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, I think that here we have to focus on what the institutions are doing as at large, right? They need to stop this whole Jesus forgives you and so do we mentality. I'm not against forgiveness, because I think that abusers are often in need of help as well to heal whatever trauma they may come with that led them to that behavior. And so the issue is that churches and institutions just cleanse the sins with religion and do absolutely nothing to solve the root cause of the problem. And this guy needed therapy, not Jesus.
I have to say that I completely agree with that. And that, I think, is one of the easy things that we can all clearly recognize in this situation is that, as we've all hit on, these people need help. I don't think they're going to find it at an altar. I don't think they're going to find it praying to to Jesus or any other God. But I think that this mentality and this live and let live, all is forgiven mentality just allows this cycle to continue rather than actually address it. However, speaking of allowing a cycle to continue, if you want to continue the cycle of seeing more nonprofits, click down below.